Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Freeman. I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Association of Museums, and welcoming you to our October Technology Roundup. This is focused on our Finding Alternative Futures program that we're working on currently in Houston. I'm really honored to be joined by three really great thought leaders that I've worked with over the years. In my previous life, back in, I guess, the early 20 teens, I guess, pre-pandemic times, I was fortunate enough to work at the New Media Consortium in Austin. And part of the work that we did there was involved the Horizon Report, which is a longitudinal study that looked at the impact of technology in teaching and learning settings. And so we focused on higher ed, K-12, libraries, and museums. I was one of the co-authors and editors of some of the reports. I think I worked on about 24 reports total before the NMC ceased its existence. But to get to the report, we had a lot of online discussions with an expert panel. And these three individuals joined me on the expert panel to engage in discussion around how mobile technology use, for example, might impact museum education. So really excited to bring the group back together. We're focusing on the future. We were in 2015 looking at what might be happening in 2020, and that future accelerated very quickly. And we are all in a place where, to say the least, we're all in a place where technology is no longer a nice to know, but a need to know. And so some of the conversations we've had years ago are starting to trickle across the museum community. So I'm really excited to bring Ed and our two guests on this conversation today. I'm going to be recording the chat, or watching the chat. So if you have any questions about things that we're talking about, we do want you to engage in the discussion. So there may be periodically where we stop and maybe invite you to turn on your microphone and ask your question. We have this set up in meeting so that we can see each other and make sure to. There's other ways to engage. There's reactions, on the bottom. You can, raise your hand or do other, things if you see something. There you go. Someone's already showing the confetti, so somebody's excited. So please engage with us in the chat and with the reactions, and then I'll find some time to break into the conversation so we can speak to you directly. I think that's been really nice about having these national thought leaders with us today. With that, I want to introduce the co-host here, Ed Rodley. He's the co-founder and principal of the Experience Alchemists. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you for having me, Alex. Very happy to be here. I remembered to unmute before talking, so I'm sure it will happen at least once more before this is over, so don't feel, it's not a 2021 meeting unless somebody says you're on mute at least once. So yeah, welcome everybody. We're very happy to have you here today, and we're particularly happy to have our special guests, Elizabeth Merritt and Coven Smith here. And when Alex and I were talking about what we wanted to see happen with Finding Alternative Futures Phase 2 and communicating the results to the Texas community at large, one of the things that we thought about was actually trying to get opportunities for you all to not just read what people are writing or hear what people are thinking, but actually have the opportunity to be able to talk to them, have conversations, and be able to get more up-to-date information, right? One of the things that sort of defines 2021 is how fast everything is moving, and how none of us actually know what life is going to look like in a year or 6 months or maybe even 4 months. So this shared state of not knowing that we're in makes this kind of up-to-date communication even more important. So today what we're going to be doing is talking with Beth and Coven about what they're seeing happening right now. So one of the things that they both have as part of their day jobs is talking with people all over the country and all over the world about what's happening in museums. And being able to identify emerging trends in particular is a thing that they both have long track records of doing. And rather than me introduce them, I was hoping I could just say, like, here's your title and your name, and you could give us a little bit of what your own introduction of yourself is, if you guys don't mind. If not, I'm happy to read your bio statement, but I think it would be more interesting to folks to hear, like, how did you get where you are now? Like, that's a question I always want to ask speakers at these kinds of webinars, like, why are you here? So if that's okay with the two of you, I'll, of course, put Coven on the spot and say, Coven Smith, who is the Senior Director for Arts for the Knight Foundation, most recently, although he has a long, illustrious history in museums. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your own professional journey, Coven, and what you're doing today at Knight Foundation?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. I should mention that I'm calling to you from Austin, so I'm also in the neighborhood. Yeah, I have been at the Knight Foundation for now close to 7 months, I think. Before that, as Ed mentioned, I was doing museum technology for about 20 years. Most recently at the Blanton Museum of Art here in Austin, and many years as a consultant. But then before that, the Denver Art Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And my background before that was as a musician. I used to lead a big band, play drums and stuff. And I still do one of those two things, but I'll not disclose which. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Excellent. I'd just like to point out before Elizabeth starts that the Venn diagram of musicians and people in museum technology has a surprising amount of overlap. You could put together a really large, diverse band. I don't know why that is, but there you have it. So yes, Elizabeth Merritt, Vice President, Strategic Foresight and Founding Director of the Center for the Future of Museums. Did I get that right?
You did, and I think you get extra points for that. I also
that was the main reason why I didn't want to introduce you.
I don't think that title is long enough, but it sort of says it all. But to give a very little background, so I founded and launched the Center for the Future of Museums at the American Alliance of Museums in 2008. As I like to point out, it launched during another disaster, the financial crash of 2008. So I'm sort of back in my comfort zone of helping museums deal with disruptive change. Before that, I ran the Alliance's excellence programs, museum assessment program, accreditation, standards. And I'd like to say only semi-humorously that put me in a perfect position to then turn around and as a futurist question all of those assumptions and say, well, but things could be different in the future, because I literally did write the book on museum standards for the US. And before coming to the Alliance, I actually worked in the field. I worked in museums for 15 years before I came to AAM. Just before I made the switch, I was the Director of Collections and Research at Cincinnati Museum Center. My training is actually in ecology and evolution and cell biology, which sometimes creeps into my metaphors. I'll also offer a little Easter egg for any of you interested in more details of my life. Lord knows why you'd be. But I wanted to point it out that the Trends Watch reports, which is the major Foresight report that I write for AAM every year, I looked at all the pieces that people never read, like the author bios, and I said, I bet I could play with those and nobody would ever notice. So every year in Trends Watch, my biography is something pretty wacky with revealing little facts that you would otherwise never know. So whether or not you read it.
Love it. Absolutely love it. All right. Thank you for mentioning Trends Watch in particular, Elizabeth. Hopefully all of y'all have had an opportunity to come across AAM's Trend Watch report in your travels. If not, it is definitely something you should look up even while this call is going on, because it is one of the very few resources out there that will give you a sort of yearly look at what's happening in the field and how things are evolving, which is something that, as Alex mentioned at the top of the program here, was a thing that the NMC's Horizon report was great for, being able to see, like, okay, what do we think is going to be on the horizon in the next 12 months? What's going to be happening in the next 3 years? Being able to put your finger on what are the things that everybody is losing sleep over is hugely helpful. Okay, so what I wanted to do to start with was to ask the two of you a few questions based on reports that I've read from the Knight Foundation and from AAM. And I know that you weren't directly authors of either of them, but as people who are out there in the field, talking to everybody, I don't imagine you don't have opinions about how things are going right now. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to pick on Coven again, since the Knight Foundation report I'm interested in is sort of the older of the two. So there was a report that came out before you started Coven called Digital Readiness and Innovation in Museums, which is mentioned in the blog post that goes along with this talk. And some of the key takeaways that came out of that sort of snapshot of immediately pre-pandemic American museum practice, I think are sort of interesting baselines for looking at how things have gone over the course of the pandemic, and hopefully through what will be the recovery from the pandemic, fingers crossed. And the Knight Foundation reports I found over the last few years have been really good at giving you really succinct summaries. You don't have to go through 60 pages of narrative in order to come away with what are the key points. And this idea that pre-pandemic, the things that were going on most in terms of digital readiness and innovation in museums were there was severely limited staffing for anything digital. Lots of places were still struggling with the idea of what their strategies were around digital engagement. Digital projects, although not exclusively digital projects, tended to be pretty siloed and very poorly tracked in terms of what their impact was, what the outcomes were, what counts as success. While on the flip side of that, leadership support for digital projects routinely rated very highly, like, yes, this is something we should do, from the highest levels of museum leadership. And then the last of the takeaways was that audience insights about digital audiences are very, very poorly integrated into how the museum does their digital business. And most of these insights are pretty shallow. Like, what does your online audience look like? Who are they? What are they doing? What do they like? What do they not like? And so if that is our January 2020 state of the field, what have you been seeing in the last year and a half, Coven, about, has this changed much? And if so, how? Like, what differences are you seeing now in museums' responses almost a year and a half into basically drop everything and figure out how to redo all of our business?
Yeah, I mean, I would say those findings still, unfortunately, for the most part, hold and are reflective of what we're seeing now. I mean, digital staffing remains pretty limited. Dedicated digital staffing remains limited. If anything, I feel that scenario is probably a little worse now than it was. Largely due to some, rather large layoff or some significant layoffs at some rather large institutions. I think on the whole, the sector has sort of lost a lot of domain-specific digital expertise, that unfortunately I think we're unlikely to get back, save some sort of miracle occurring. Digital strategies still remain, I think we characterize them as emergent in the report, which basically means nobody's doing them yet.
But we talk about them.
Right, yeah. So, I think we're not, this, anecdotally at the Knight Foundation, I wouldn't say that we're seeing a significant shift in the status of those things. I think what we are seeing is quite a significant shift in the sort of awareness of the importance of these things. Or, I'm sometimes a little bit more flip about it, where I say it's like the awareness that a museum is not doing very much digitally or hasn't invested in a digital strategy. The director, when they talk to us about that in the past, it would have been like, I would characterize that as sort of like, yeah, we're not doing it. I mean, we'll get around to it, to now a feeling of tremendous guilt that they have let so many years go by without investing in that, and now feeling like, oh my gosh, we have so much catching up to do. There's barely a discussion I have with a museum director that doesn't start with, We just know how far behind we are, to which I have to say, well, you're not alone, you know.
I have exactly the same conversations. And if everybody's far behind, then who's actually
who's setting the pace here exactly? But yeah, so, you know, I'd say that, you know, the findings of that report are still pretty prescient today. I do sense, you know, a groundswell of activity towards developing more digital strategies. We certainly are getting, you know, on the arts team side here at Knight, we are getting a lot more institutions coming to us. Instead of saying like, hey, we want to do this flashy experimental digital project, coming to us with much more sort of foundational things like, you know, hey, we are looking to hire staff, or we, you know, we are looking to develop a digital strategy. We are looking for help in doing so. So I would say that is a positive change, if not one that necessarily we're tracking on a numerical basis yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. Actually, that is a good lead up for a thing that I forgot to do already, which was to pass the mic back to Alex to just give a little bit of an update on FAF1 and FAF phase 2 for folks who aren't necessarily familiar with it, just to provide some local context for why this conversation is happening.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Ed. And I know that some of our participants in the program currently are in the call. So finding alternative futures. It predates my time at the Texas Association of Museums. I've been here, it'll be 3 years next month. What a crazy 3 years that's been. 1 year of prep work, and then trying to figure out how to connect in this new way. But before I came on board, I was fortunate enough to be part of on TAM's council. And so I saw firsthand some of the work that we've been doing in our special projects. And in 2017, we launched the important initiative, Finding Alternative Futures, Sustainability Through Coaching. And that project explored fresh ways for about 11 history museums and organizations in Houston to address issues of relevance and financial sustainability under the guidance of experienced coaches. So having some folks that have worked with many different types of museums to go in and help them figure out how, you know, what their future might look like. And this was pre-pandemic. So through years of research that culminated really in the Summerly report that's really well known here in Texas. That report found that many institutions were struggling for survival. And as I mentioned, that was before the pandemic. And although museums and other history organizations conduct important work, you know, by collecting and interpreting history, they often do so in a precarious financial position and inadequate community support. So we found these museums to be at risk. And so that program, Finding Alternative Futures, was designed to help. So for the requirements for inclusion in that project is really museum leadership open to significant change. Change management is often what a lot of these projects hinge on, is really knowing that you want to move to a different state. So these coaches worked with the staff and board members that were really eager to do things differently because really, frankly, what they were doing wasn't working very well. These participants engaged in a 15-month coaching relationship and which helped them assess what their options were for sustainability and improving standards of operations, while others considered very creative alternatives to how they presented their collection and engaged with audiences. That project was made possible by a lead grant from the Houston Endowment and additional support from the Summerly Foundation in Dallas. And so that project wrapped up in 2019. And as that project was wrapping up, we were looking at how we might do a phase 2. And that came about in late 2019, early 2020. And so this is where we are now, is in the phase 2 project, which is made possible by the Houston Endowment. So that planning began about a year ago in September during the height of the pandemic. And it's taking place currently in 8-county region around Houston, the service area for the Houston Endowment. And we built on the successful first phase. While The second phase retains the key components such as the one-on-one coaching and capacity building for financial sustainability. We really want to be focused on digital readiness and technologies that can help move the museum community forward in the current environment. So they found a need as we created this to not only talk about technology, but learn how to deliver it in a way that we have been, I think we've met once face-to-face in Houston and hope to meet again. But that's really where, you know, the way that we deliver our professional development is, you know, primarily through Zoom, Google Classroom, other methods. So again, we're working in two avenues. One is convening 10 museums that make a good fit for the project, looking for change. And these are the only 10 that are in the cohort, and some of them are represented on this call today. So if you want to use your reactions, just raise your hand if you are a part of the FAF2 cohort, that'd be great. And so the other emphasis of the concept is the development of 4 online content modules that really serve as the core of the FAF2. Okay, great. Hello. Good to see y'all. So these online offerings address some of the central challenges raised by museum in a needs assessment that we conducted about a year ago. And then we worked on a follow-up focus group to really see, you know, what were some of the issues that were impeding progress in the Houston cohort. And so we assembled an advisory board the special development opportunity in Google Classroom to increase fluency in digital applications, requirements, and solutions. So part of it's self-paced learning online, part of it's one-on-one virtual coaching, and some of it's resource sharing and networking. But the 4 major topics that we're focused on that are the subject of Ed Rodley's reports are online programming, operational capacity and continuity, community engagement, and digital savvy leadership. So back to Ed. Ed was, we engaged Ed from the Experience Alchemists as our museum scholar in residence to look at this pertinent research and the conversations had around these 4 different topics. And his posts are hosted on our TAM Labs blog on the 3rd Wednesday of each month through June of 2022. If you look at the calendar, you'll see that we're on the 3rd Wednesday today. And so instead of posting a blog, we decided to have a chat with some folks that are really close to this information. So currently our Houston cohort has completed the online programming module and is working on operational capacity and continuity, and before finishing up the last 2 modules. Our goal is to really engage the broader museum community through member-centric posts on our blog and discussions, and use this testing group to help improve our modules so that we can repackage and represent the work that we're doing to a larger cohorts outside of the Houston community in the summer of 2022. So we're really learning and building as we go, and hopefully repackage it for greater distribution to outside of Houston. But thank you to the Houston Endowment for letting us do our work. It came at a very important time where a lot of the way that we communicate and the way we engage audiences have changed. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on how we got here, you know, the early project, how that turned into something that we really hope will have greater impact across the museum field. So thank you, Ed, for letting me break in and kind of give a little bit of the background of it, and let's return to the program.
Thank you, Alex. I think that it's very important to have that context, because we are, particularly at this time in history, it's so easy to just get lost in the present. You know, the fact that we're having a Zoom call with 30-odd people on it 2 years ago would have been kind of noteworthy just in and of itself. Like, wow, you got 30 people to show up on a Zoom call? Like, that's amazing. Enter pandemic, you know, wreck all of our preconceptions and established ways of doing things, and suddenly the abnormal becomes completely standard. And one of the things that I most appreciate about the way that TAM has framed the project, this idea of finding alternative futures, I think is extremely valuable. Like, that, you know, museums are so heterogeneous, right? What we lump under the category of museum can be so diverse that this idea that there is a future that is going to work for everybody, you know, is kind of ridiculous if you poke at it a little bit. And that notion of being open to trying to find them is, I think, a worthy endeavor, like, and doing it in public where the rest of the field can actually follow along and see if there are things that are useful to them is one of a service, not just to the Texas community, but to sort of the larger national, international community as well. So I'm very happy to be part of this. Like, this is the kind of thing I would have showed up at anyway. So it's even better to be able to actually be kind of MC as well. And I saw Elizabeth give it a heart there. As someone who spends all of her time thinking about the future, Elizabeth, if you had to look at where we are right now in terms of how rapidly a field that is not noted for its nimbleness has adapted to a new hybrid reality, like what do you see happening right now that gives you hope for what museums may start looking like post-pandemic? That's kind of a loaded question, and I apologize in advance for it.
No, that's quite all right. It's totally in the futurist ballpark. I think what gives me hope is this, as with any disruption, having an upside, is it jolted people out of their zone of complacency. And it made people naturally engage in an exercise that futurists encourage people to do anyway, which is to question assumptions. And one of the exercises I do with people in workshops is we group generate a list of 100 things, 100 statements that are true about museums, and then we write the opposite and say, whoa, wait a minute, blow your mind. What would it take to have, museums are nonprofits to museums are not nonprofits? And I think that the pandemic essentially was a living laboratory for that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the assumptions that museums were having to question were not unique to museums. They're things that all businesses and society were going through. So for example, for over a decade, we've had this conversation about who gets to work remotely and can people really effectively work, and managers saying, oh, we can't do this. People will just goof off if they're telecommuting, and I can't manage people if I can't walk around and see them working. And the massive answer during the pandemic has been, nope, it works. And in many cases, it makes a lot of people happier and more efficient. And they've discovered that it gives them better quality of life. And there are downsides. Some people don't prefer it. But it answered that question. Nobody was willing to do the experiment until we had to. Right. And I think that what we're seeing is museums are taking this data about what they did and didn't do and what they had to do during the pandemic and evaluating, well, can we stop doing that? Can we keep doing this? This is something that we might adapt for post-pandemic times because it was so successful. Just to name one, because it's such a large discussion and we'll get into more of it later, but one of the things that I wanted to mention in case people aren't following it is the culture track research, culture and community in a time of crisis. And I'm dropping a link into chat. I see Ed's a fan. And one of the really interesting findings they had was that when you survey people in the public to say what was happening to you during the pandemic, how did you feel, what did you do? One of the interesting findings was that for every kind of museum, looking at separately by natural history museums, art museums, science museums, history museums, an awful lot of the people using the digital resources weren't people who normally visit museums, which really questions a lot of our assumptions about who can enjoy our stuff, who sees themselves or could see themselves as museum people, or what does museum even mean to them? What are the resources that we were offering digitally that they could access and valued that they didn't or couldn't make the time to access in person? I think during this discussion, there are a lot of places you might have to cut me off because this could go on forever.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on you just in case. Yes, I think for people who haven't come across La Placa Cohen's Culture Track reports, funded in part by the Knight Foundation, thank you, Coven, they are an amazing resource for seeing what the American public thinks about culture, small c culture, as opposed to what cultural heritage professionals tend to think about when they think about capital C culture. And the disparities between the two of them are amazing. And to be able to see them laid out in beautiful tabular form, I think is extremely helpful. One of the things that I come across in my work all the time is trying to get particularly museum leaders to think about what their audiences view as the competition, for lack of a better word, but as a free choice learning environment, which is something you do in your spare time. What are the other things that are competing for your attention? And it's not just the orchestra and the ballet and the theater and the museum. You know, people, when you ask them culture without explaining what it is, they talk about going to restaurants, going to a bar and hanging out with their friends, going to the park. Like, all of that counts as culture, in the fact that that bucket is so much bigger than we tend to think about it when we describe it within the field, is a real, can be a real problem, because we're not really focusing on what people are, what is the full universe of choices people are making. Like, when they decide to go to your museum, they're deciding not to do any of these other things. And it's a much more rich assortment than we tend to think of. Koven, you had talked earlier about your conversations with museum directors, and Beth's talking about, you know, the fact that we managed to adapt to this drastic shift so radically, so quickly. Makes me wonder, in your conversations with executive leaders, where everybody pretty much feels like they're behind the 8 ball, they're behind the times, they recognize it, they feel bad about it. Like, what are the things that you are seeing affecting decision-making at the executive levels in the field? Like, how are museum leaders thinking differently about the future, and particularly this this strange moment we're in now, where everybody has a realization of digital audiences and digital engagement much more viscerally than they did even a year ago. But we're at that point where institutions are reopening. You know, when everybody was closed, it was very easy to do the quote unquote pivot to digital, because that was the only game in town for a while. But now these new audiences have been explored by lots of different organizations, from the very tiny to the very large. Everybody knows that there are people out there, as Elizabeth pointed out. In many ways, they're also not the physical audience. They are a separate audience segment who would not come even if the building were open. But now decisions are having to be made in terms of staffing and budgets, and where is the emphasis going to go in the future? What are you seeing in terms of how leaders are grappling with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we are seeing is a transition from, we used to say the digital pivot, which I never quite believed in, because in most institutions that would imply you stopped doing one thing and started doing another thing. For most institutions, it was, well, we just added a whole new class of things on top of what we were already doing, but we kept doing those old things too. And so now I don't hear pivot talked about very much. Everyone talks about hybrid, that we are going to be a hybrid organization moving forward, which I think is actually a more sort of accurate assessment of what actually occurred when the pandemic began. And I think, I think some of that is, as you alluded to, Ed, with the, the sort of viscerality of it, that it's like, I mean, museum directors can see the numbers. They can see, it's, I mean, I remember speaking to a VP at a, rather prominent aquarium who basically said, during the summer of 2020, our summer programs turned a profit for the first time ever. It's the first time that it ever occurred, because it was the first time that they could actually let in the kinds of numbers that would make, the development and support for those programs, realize an actual return on the investment. So, I think like the numbers are there, and certainly there, I think of organizations like the Gantt Center in Charlotte, who we have worked with, where they were just seeing tremendous visitation for their online programs, almost all of which was from outside of Charlotte, and a lot of visitors from outside the country altogether. And they saw it was like, oh, well, we clearly have a voice here that we, always with that sort of local focus had not necessarily realized we had. And so, I do think, I mean, it's easy to be cynical, especially having done technology for so long in museums, and say, okay, well, finally everyone is coming around to what we've been saying for so long. But I do think we are at a real moment where it's like, I think a lot of institutions are starting to explore that model, and in a very sort of sincere way, you know, not just like, let's get more numbers, but like, oh, hey, this might be a different way for us to be a museum, a more sort of inclusive and responsive way to be a museum. And I think it's a really, I mean, it's an interesting moment. I mean, it's tinged with all kinds of sadness given what we've lost, but it is a moment.
Great, thank you for that. Yes, it is definitely a moment. What is that? That Arabic curse, may you live in interesting times. It is sort of fascinating to be so clear that nobody out there knows what the right way forward is, and we're all just going to have to try to figure out how we adapt to this new reality. And that the AAM report that's included in the blog post is all about adapting to a hybrid reality, right? It is no longer a potentiality, you know, to your point, Coven, of the way that museum technology, digital technology has been treated in the past as sort of the, you know, in the olden days, in the before times, it was the preserve of the very largest, most well-funded museums who could afford to have like somebody who did digital stuff, or even, God forbid, a digital department. And for the 99.8% of the rest of the field, that idea that this was all just too far beyond us. We don't have the resources, we don't have the staff. And the reality of the pandemic has really made it clear that pretty much anybody out there who has an audience could have a digital audience. And certainly in my travels, most of the success stories that I've been seeing have not necessarily been coming from large, well-funded, well-heeled institutions, because they tended to be the ones who shed huge numbers of staff the earliest. It's been smaller places with a much more local focus who were able to somehow figure out how to straddle that physical program delivery they used to do with digital formats. What would be an example of that? Oh, Old Salem in North Carolina, right? Somehow overnight, they became a fairly well-known entity on TikTok because they started recording some of the demonstrations that their costumed interpreters used to do. So if you were interested in 18th century bread baking or wood turning, and it turns out, you know, you can find an audience for pretty much anything online. And there are lots of people out there who bake, and there are lots of people out there who engage in woodworking. And suddenly they have an audience that they were very clear were not an audience who were ever going to come to North Carolina. This is exclusively a digital audience who was able to find them because they were out there and had done tremendous amounts in terms of raising their brand awareness, to put on a marketing hat for a second.
Well, and I think, oh, sorry, just to follow on from that, Ed, I mean, I think the moment that is sort of interesting here is that, I mean, you know, to look at it in sort of digital terms, this is definitely very much a long tail phenomenon, you know, in that I sort of feel like this moment kind of almost privileges those museums that have these very unique and singular focuses, you know, in the sense that it's like, you know, if you're a giant municipal art collection, the difference in, you know, in the experience of that collection versus yet another giant municipal museum art collection is, you know, it's sort of like, well, I mean, you know, why go to the giant museum art collection when the Met is literally right there? However, you know, the such and such museum of maritime art, you know, somewhere in Maine has this collection that is unavailable anywhere else and is of interest to a lot smaller group of people, but of an intense interest. And so it's almost like for the first time, there's a possibility of museums sort of realizing this sort of like, well, there's a whole audience out there. And as long as I'm not dependent on that audience being physically present within the city limits,
right,
there's a possibility for me to connect with them. You know, whether that will, that's a very sort of like, you know, techno utopian take on this, but I mean, it's interesting though.
Yeah.
No, I actually want to stay with that for a minute, Coven, because I think it's actually illustrating one of the areas where technology provides something to some museums that they simply didn't have before. I really like your distinction between niche and generalized. And I would say it's a good example of how the people who are finding those specialized content may not care it's a museum. They don't give a hoot that it's a Billings Farm and Museum or the Basket Weaving Museum. They're interested in that particular topic. And one of the things about the internet is, especially if you make yourself findable when you put the content up in an accessible way, people from around, you may not have a big enough local audience to really make you thrive on the few people in your area that are interested in learning how to shoe horses. But if you have an international enthusiasm of people who really want your experience with historic farrier practice, you can at least build up the audience and the fans and then figure out how to turn it into a financial income stream. And you're absolutely right. That's very different from going to a big museum whose physical experience may be unique, because that's where I can go downtown on a Sunday with my family. It only takes me 20 minutes and I like hanging out and I like the atmosphere, and it's a place, it's one of my third places. But online, there's nothing to distinguish it. I mean, even if they have a really excellent high quality program, how do they make it known and findable that it might be better than the 3,000 other things that would show up in a search algorithm about 19th century art?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. You know, and this moment kind of privileges uniqueness of voice in a way that I'm not sure we've really seen to this degree before. You know, that it's like a unique voice sort of makes you findable in a way that just like a totally awesome collection maybe kind of doesn't actually. You know, it doesn't sort of lift you up above the morass of everything else. So yeah, it's an interesting moment.
And the other thing is, one of the things that I worry about, now I'm going to get a little dystopian on you.
Bring it.
Futurists tend to do that. We all, taking aside technology, museums were already experiencing that in our ruthlessly capitalist economy, people were watching to see what are the things that museums do that actually are wildly popular and profitable, peeling them off and doing them as standalone things without the really expensive parts. So whether it's sort of rental venues doing the big blockbuster exhibits in a rental venue, and people were willing to go see them in a convention center, not going to the museum and helping underwrite the collections and research and all the knowledge that actually helped create that exhibit to begin with. Or even something like Meow Wolf. No disrespect to Meow Wolf. I haven't had a chance to go yet. I've heard it's a fabulous experience, but you know, you get people willing to stand in line for 2 hours and pay $100 for secondary market tickets. And they're creating an immersive experience that doesn't bear the same expenses of collections and scholarship and preservation that a museum would. So that's setting aside digital. And when you look at digital affordances, I'm worried about, one potential is that people are going to see what museums manage to do online that is really popular. And they'll do that without the expense of having the museum behind the scenes. I think the double strength of those very unique museums is they're building on something so deep and so difficult to replicate. It isn't just, we have great digital art and you can walk through a digital gallery. It's something where nobody's going to say, well, I'm going to become the expert in Native American basket weaving because I bet I can make money online by having a worldwide following. So I think as museums try and figure out the right digital strategy for themselves, it's also trying to think about that tie between who they are and what they do uniquely, and then what could go online versus what anybody could do online if they put enough thought and effort into it and thought they could make money from it.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for mentioning immersive Van Goghs without mentioning immersive Van Goghs, Elizabeth.
Sounds like somebody's going to bring it up.
Well, at least it wasn't me for a change, so that's great. But I want to poke a little bit more at this leaning into uniqueness, because I think rather than talking about technologies and methodologies and skills and training, like, this is something that is core pretty much to every organization that anybody representing here is about. Like, what is the thing that our institution does, and being able to think about that in terms of what do we do that nobody else does, particularly in this particular moment in time, I think is a really interesting, important way to think about what the hybrid reality of 2022 and 23 is going to look like, and then sort of going forward. So what is the question that I'm trying to ask that I'm not phrasing as a question? I guess what I would do is I would throw it back to the two of you to see if there are other things you can think of that you've come across in your travels that count as the same kinds of examples of people adapting to this new reality in terms of moving forward in ways that are more than just, okay, as COVID said, we need to do all our stuff and we all need to do all our digital stuff and we need to do it all the time. Like, who out there is looking at things differently, and what are models that people might look to for places that are trying their own particular alternative future? Coven Smith.
Or Elizabeth, if you have one, you look like you may have something locked and loaded there.
Oh, no, I'm looking up some background material for my argument. You go first.
Oh, very well, okay. I think some of the, like one of the more interesting kind of adaptations I've seen take place is actually at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. Which is, one of the first things, and apologies, it's really easy to be like, here's a New York museum. And I know we do that a lot, but the Cooper Hewitt did a really interesting thing very early in the pandemic, which is they pivoted to employ their visitor services staff to start working on accessible descriptions of works in their collection. So that low or no sight visitors who were visiting the museum's website would be able to experience works in the collection via screen reading or other assistive technology. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was something that was just really interesting, where it was like there was this clear sort of resource there, and that these are the people that were closest to the public, knew what kinds of questions get asked about the collection all the time, and were sort of like well positioned, well situated to start to address those kinds of questions in a very different way. And so I think like that kind of adaptation is really interesting to me. And I've seen other sort of smaller scale examples of that, of like, well, like obviously, especially early in the pandemic, our visitor services staff are not serving anyone at the moment. The building is closed. So, what is the distinct and unique knowledge that they have that we can do something with in a different way? So I love those kinds of things, because it's sort of barely technology. I mean, it's kind of like facilitated by technology, but like that's not really at the core of what makes that special.
But I think it is a great sort of poster child for how this particular pandemic has altered what was a pretty stable landscape. Like for years, every digital asset manager I know in the museum field has complained about how poorly described all of the images are in their collection, let alone on their website. And it was a problem universally recognized and universally hardly ever dealt with until this year, suddenly, when people are coming up with these kinds of interesting responses to it. If you actually dedicate bodies to it, they don't need to understand much about, they don't need to understand anything about HTML. All they need is some very quick training in how do you write an accessible description, and you can generate pretty decent content. And the benefit of that is enormous.
And I think one interesting follow-on from that, that I've seen in a couple of the institutions we work with, is we've seen some people sort of rapidly accelerate up out of visitor services into more sort of content production roles because they were turned out to be so good at it. And I think that's a thing that to me is really interesting and has always been interesting to me about technology in museums, is that I think we sometimes overprivilege sort of technical knowledge and underprivileged domain knowledge, like an understanding of the content. And this is one of those cases where it's like that sort of transition was made possible not because the museum suddenly had all this technical acumen that it did not previously possess, was because like people who really understood the content were sort of unleashed in a new way. And it's just one of those things that I continue to love and find fascinating about museums.
That's a great positive example. So thank you for that, Coven.
Well, we try.
Elizabeth.
Okay, I'm trying to, I have to confess that I usually focus on what museums are doing and why, and only secondarily how they're doing it. So I'm having trouble quickly filtering by digital in my head, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go ahead and ruthlessly exploit ruthlessly exploit the fact that I'm on this panel as a futurist to leap to one of the fringier possibilities. Confess, that's why you invite me to do these things, because I bring up the wacky alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing, and some of this I can cite examples, but part of it I'm going to have to go on off the record conversations because I haven't gotten people to write about it yet, and you'll see why. One of the things that museums used technology for during the pandemic was to try and reduce risk to staff and volunteers by visitors by creating digital interfaces or technological interfaces in place of human staff, right? So like the one example that comes to mind is the Ontario Regiment Museum in Canada, which is a World War II museum. Basically deployed a little AI-powered chatbot on a telepresence robot body to check in visitors and ask them basic health questions, but also to give them an orientation to the museum. Well, museums, we know from AAM's COVID surveys, some museums had to do significant layoffs because of the money they lost, and some of them were waiting to hear how they're planning to rebuild. But staffing costs are traditionally, a big chunk, I mean, generalizing 70% of a lot of museums' budgets. And if they're having to rebuild with a smaller income stream or make up losses now that our pandemic assistance has run out, staff is maybe one of the things they have to look at. Well, so I wonder if more museums are going to start saying, are there staff positions that we could replace with digital or AI-powered functions, whether it's automated check-in. I go to a lot of hotels now where there's nobody at the desk to check me in. There's a screen, and frankly, when I'm getting there at 11 at night and I'm pooped, I might rather deal with a machine than a person. Are there going to be, for example, more AI chatbots answering the phone and trying to route you through the basic questions instead of having a person talking to you? And I have talked to directors that are trying to figure out, what are post-pandemic, how are we going to staff? I'm pivoting now to something I think was on the agenda for later anyway, that I want to make sure we're going to get to. Are we going to choose to have fewer but better jobs, because next time there's a crisis, we want to make sure the people we employ have stable, well-paid jobs with benefits so that they're not as vulnerable? Conversely, are some museums going to say we're going to outsource a bunch of stuff because it's easier to end a contract nimbly than to have to worry about downsizing staff? And I think one element of that is, are more museums going to integrate digital processes in place of staff? There's been a lot of nice language around AI to try and make people not afraid by, it's not going to take jobs, it's going to supplement your work. But the fact is, in the industries where they've made a lot of inroads, it does sometimes replace jobs. Sometimes even white collar knowledge-based jobs. And that could happen in museums as well. So downside, maybe fewer museum jobs. Upside, maybe better and well-paid museum jobs for the remaining staff, and more robust ability to maintain those services because you don't have to lay off the II when your payroll gets constrained.
You just kill the process and it goes away. Yeah. Okay, so to follow up on that, and also to respond to a comment that somebody has left in the chat, a lot of what we've been talking about are responses of existing organizations. So I'd like to turn it a little bit to get you both to be a little bit more futuristy. And if you were going to be starting a museum in 2022, what do you think the staff would look like in that institution? If you're going to build one from the ground up, you're not worrying about any sort of legacy positions. It's all brand new, all the first time. What are the kinds of jobs that people are going to be having in that museum? And particularly, are there kinds of jobs that don't currently exist that you would see happening in a brand new scratch-built museum? Coben.
No.
You feel picked on.
A bit. He said futurist. I was hoping maybe you would take this one first so I could formulate a response. But Well, actually, this is an interesting question because we at Knight are working with a few organizations that are sort of very much in a startup phase. And I think the question there depends on what the sort of size or what the prominence of the organization is, what its sort of fundraising capabilities currently are. So like if you were literally starting from nothing, I mean, if it's like, I'm someone with a great idea and I want to start a museum and you need to sort of build the brand first, I would say the first thing you do is you hire a communications director / social media manager. That would be the first role I would hire. I mean, you know, especially if, you know, if you're having to build a presence for an institution well before you've got a physical presence. I mean, I feel like that's one of the first things, you know, because it's like you need a continuity of voice there. And ironically, I feel like you could contract in curators and educators that I hope I don't get punched for saying that out loud, but you know, I feel like, you know, you can bring in a guest curator to, you know, to develop programming or, you know, or to curate an exhibition. But I think you need a continuity of presence that, you know, when you're establishing a sort of presence for an institution before it's a, you know, physical building or whatever, that really requires somebody with an understanding of a voice who can tune that appropriately and articulate it to what the needs are. So there's my answer.
That's great.
Over to you, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you so much for this question, Ed, because it gives me a question, and it gives me the opportunity to share one of my passionate philosophies about starting museums. Pro tip, AAM's about to release a starting a museum toolkit for which I just wrote an introduction and a quiz for prospective museum founders.
All right.
Do you really want to be a museum founder? I would start with the question, what is the difference the museum is trying to make in the world? Who is it trying to serve and what do those people need? Because without starting from that, you don't know who you need to hire. I just spoke with the director of the Utica Children's Museum, which, long story short, ended up merging with ICANN, which is a local social service organization for children and families with dealing with trauma. And I talked to her about who she intends to hire, and she says probably a lot of them are people who have degrees in social work, because that's the audience they're serving. And even if it weren't that specific, I'd say it depends very much on who is around you and who you want to love you and feel need you. In some communities, another thing AAM just did is we just finished a survey on trust. And, you know, great news, museums, highly trusted organizations, but there is variations in levels of trust by demographics, including race. And certainly the pandemic has exposed the fact that we have a need for trusted institutions that are trusted by everyone in society. And if a museum is trying to serve a community that might have distrust in historical institutions or traditional institutions that are seen as Western culture, you might start by just collecting staff who represent that community and saying, how do we build this from the ground up in a model that actually is culturally appropriate and serves people's needs and reinforces their values?
Yeah, great answer. I appreciate being able to talk about staffing in ways that don't immediately devolve into the layoffs, good, bad, precarity of the museum sector, good, bad, and really focusing on possible solutions, doing it better. It's a little bit of a non sequitur, but there was just an article in the press recently. The Art Institute of Chicago has disbanded its entire docent program, like the classic large art museum, tons of volunteers, mostly female, mostly older, very strong class of small scale donors, but not very representative of the greater Chicago area. You know, they tend to be much more affluent and much whiter than the community in Chicago at large. And their decision to just get rid of the entire program is, I'm dying to see what the rationale is that they come out with for that, because I hope what they're trying to do is start all over again and build something that is more representative and, hopefully better. But will it be just a new crop of volunteers, or will it be a smaller crop of maybe paid interpreters? Or I don't know. But the fact that even places like the Art Institute are engaging in this kind of large scale experimentation tells you that pretty much everything's on the table. There is no aspect of museum function that is not amenable to being disrupted by this pandemic. Even when it comes to like collections, like how many people do you need taking care of your collections? Might be fewer. They might be different than the people who have been traditionally employed in the past.
Well, to be even more disruptive, how many collections do you need?
Okay, yeah, we're not going to go down into deaccessioning at all. That will turn this whole conversation in another direction that is also fascinating, but a talk for a different subject. I think what I'd like to do now, Alex, do you have any questions? Is there anything that you've been dying for me to ask that I haven't yet, or can we turn it over to the audience?
Yeah, we actually got one from the audience here around this continuing education units credits for online programs. I know that Tam, for these modules, I know, and for the FAF programs, we're thinking of this in a badging way. I'm having conversations with Credly to look at these modules to provide some credits for taking these courses. Micro credentialing has been something we talked about quite a bit a few years. You to the completion of the courses. If you can get university credit, even better. So that's what I'm looking at. But do y'all know of any museums that are offering online credits for their programs, the specific programs that museums are creating for their audiences? So the example here is a museum could offer the history of diversity and culture, and that class credit could apply to higher ed or HR professionals. So the cross-disciplinary aspect of it, what are some ways that museums can talk about some transferable skills that can impact people outside of the museum that aren't museum professionals specifically? Any research in that area that anyone knows of?
I see Anna raising her hand.
I just wanted to share that AIA does a very good job offering professional, credentials to their audience members. Why not supplement what they're offering and be a secondary resource? Why not invite professors to come speak and meet the criteria for the credential source? And then we were able to monetize it. In corporate America, if you work for an enterprise company, a private company, your HR professionals usually give a budget for professional credentials, and sometimes it's up to $1,000, $2,000, depending on how large of a corporation you work for. So and some people will use it for college credit, or I'll say college courses, or they can use it for their CEUs. So that's a way to monetize and offer something to people during the day. And you can also nowadays you can do it on demand, of course. But I was trying to find a solution. Like how can museums are known for their braininess. Let's share the braininess and sell it. That's all.
Great. That's a great question, Anna. Thank you. One clarifying remark: which AIA are you talking about? Because I know of at least 3.
The architecture one.
Okay. That was AIA number 1. So Elizabeth Coven, any examples you can think of people engaging in micro-credentialing recently?
Well, can I just share an example I loved, even though I'm not sure it really gets at the intent of the question? those of you who follow AAM's work may know that one of our deep areas of interest is P through 12 education and how museums can be a more integral part of the quote unquote formal education system. And one of the things I've written about in the past a lot is how one of the things that may enable that is more openness to things like digital badging that would allow students to gather credentials of learning that are from a variety of sources. So it doesn't all have to be their teacher giving them a test and certifying they passed it. And they could come to a museum and get a digital badge for, biology, and it would count towards class credits. One little piece of news I saw that cheered me up was during the pandemic, the Besser Museum for Northeast Michigan offered free planetarium program visits to children who were either doing virtual distance learning or being homeschooled, and worked it out with the schools so that the schools were awarding the children extra credit. I mean, it wasn't baseline towards the requirements, but extra credit for participating in those programs. And I think that's another example of the pandemic accelerating something that could be really important and positive in the future, was schools looking to museums and officially validating credentials provided for participation in museum programming.
I love that blurring of the formal, informal, because it is kind of an artificial boundary.
And tends to leave us on the losing end in terms of.
There is also that. Although, if there is one place I would love to not be in 2021 and 22, it's in higher ed in the US. I mean, all of the problems that we have in the museum field are so much worse in academia. So we could take a moment and count our blessings.
Well, can we have a moment of sympathy for our colleagues in college and university museums and galleries? Because they're getting it from both ends.
Okay. Fair enough. Yes, we'll have a moment of silence. Okay. Coben, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Nope.
Okay.
Sorry, I have nothing intelligent to say about this.
That's okay. That's okay. I think at this point then, I'd be happy to open it up to the group if folks want to raise their hands, if they have any questions that they want to put to Elizabeth or Coven or Alex or me or each other. We'd love to hear from you. And this is a rare opportunity to get to put your questions to these folks and hopefully get an answer that will edify you. I have plenty more.
All right,
questions.
good night, everybody.
Now.
Yeah.
Give people a chance to warm up to this. While folks are thinking about that, then I'm going to hit you with my next question. We've talked a little bit about museum workforces and the fact that there was this tremendous downsizing that happened early on in the pandemic, and we're still not back to pre-pandemic levels. Are we going to get there? What is the workforce going to look like in 2023? What are the differences you see between what museums are talking about in terms of their hiring strategies?
I don't think we're ever going to get back to pre-pandemic levels of staffing. I don't see that being a possibility. I mean, certainly looking just at digital, and thinking about sort of the size of the sort of digital museum sector overall measured in terms of number of people, I'd say we're 10 years away from getting back to where we have the same number of people employed in that sector as we did 2 years ago. Coupled with the fact that I think, certainly the museum workforce, there's much more a growing awareness of the need to be paid for the work that you're actually doing, not working overtime being, the problem of over-credentialing in our sector. So, I think even when these positions come back, I'm expecting and hoping that they will come back at much higher salary levels than they went away at, which is obviously going to mean fewer of these positions are hired. So no, I think it's going to be a very, very slow recovery. And it's possible that slowness may work to our benefit in the sense that it will give everyone time to rethink what these positions should be. As opposed to let's lightning quick just rehire the people that we lost. but that's painting a very rosy picture. That's trying to find something good to say about what is not a good picture.
Well, one thing I actually appreciate about that, and I think we're both sort of hopeless optimists in many ways. One of the problems I was having in client conversations over the past few months had been talking to people who couldn't get past the return to normal. Like once the first wave of reopenings started, there was definitely a strong response, particularly among museum leaders that I talked to, like, okay, great, we survived, we're reopening, now we're just going to go back to the way things were. And I would oftentimes, to my own regret, say, well, 2019 and 2020, they weren't so great. If you cast your mind back to before the pandemic, 2019 was the year that the International Conference of Museums was unable to define museum. It was the year of all of these anonymous crowdsourced spreadsheets highlighting pay equality in the sector. Like there were any number of crises that were happening that sort of started to lay bare some of the built-in problems in the sector, and the pandemic just kind of blew the whole roof off of that. So this idea that things might take longer, but therefore be more thoughtful, is actually kind of worth legitimate hope, I would say. Certainly going back to 2019 is not going to be the answer to the way things are likely to evolve. Elizabeth, do you have anything you want to add to that? Oh, sorry, Tobin.
No. I was going to redirect, so please.
Okay.
He was pointing at me anyway.
Okay.
Yes. Do you have the patience for a somewhat discursive answer that I promise will come back to museums?
I'll give you 2 minutes.
Oh God. Can I talk that fast? I can talk really fast. All right. So one of the trends I've been watching out in the world, because for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, a lot of what I do is see what everybody else is doing and then go to museums and say, hey, this is happening. Here's how it could apply to what's happening to you or what you might do. And one of the things I'm watching is what has been dubbed the Great Resignation. You may have read of it. Has been a mass exodus of labor during the pandemic. Not all of it layoffs, a lot of it voluntary, either because people had to go take care of family or homeschool their kids, or because they didn't feel safe at work, or because they realized the trade-off they were making for what was a relatively crappy job. Can I say that? Crappy job wasn't worth what they were getting from it. And it's very extreme in Japan. This is led to the phenomenon of lying down, of basically saying, I'm not going to go have this high-powered career where I'm expected to study all day for exams or work 90 hours a week. I'm just going to be a flaneur. I'm going to figure out how I can get just enough to live with and enjoy my life, even if that's playing video games. So one industry that's being profoundly disrupted by this Great Resignation is the restaurant industry, which I've always thought was a very interesting sector to look at for contrast to museums, because when you think about it in a weird way, we have a lot of things in common. A lot of restaurants start because somebody has a vision for what they want to do. A lot of people who start restaurants don't look around and say, what this neighborhood needs? It needs a Peruvian restaurant. They say, it's always been my passionate feeling that I want to start a museum about, Nouvelle American cuisine, and I'm going to do it. And a lot of the people who work in restaurants are a combination of either people who are really driven by passion, they're willing to be a chef, they're willing to work crazy hours and have very low pay, or they're people who are passionate about something else they're doing, like being an actor or a writer, and they need a very flexible day job, or they have very few options because they're undocumented labor and they can get a job as a dishwasher. I'll let you draw your own parallels to how that lines up to the museum sector, but there are parallels. So what's happening now is a lot of people are saying, this was crazy, this was unsustainable, it was unfair, and there may be a fundamental reset. And the fact is, in the future, there may be fewer restaurants and food may cost more, and it should, because to pay people adequately and to have a really equitable and ecologically sustainable food system, what we're buying and what we're paying for and what you recompense their labor for, it shouldn't be a bunch of restaurants trying to underprice each other, because if you offer your tapas for $3 instead of $2.50, they're going to go eat at the other place. It should be saying, no, this is what it costs. And maybe eating out is something special and it's a treat and people do it less often, but it's going to provide good, stable jobs and there will be fewer restaurants. Okay, I promised to bring this back to museums. For a lot of years, we've been struggling with two trends in the museum field that are in tension. And one is that a lot of people who do work in museums do it as a passion project. It's their life stream. They're really dedicated and they sacrificed a lot to get there. They took on educational debt. They took a low-paid job. They might have done unpaid internships. But now they kind of resent the fact that what they're actually earning from the museum isn't enough to either pay back those debts or allow them to have a stable lifestyle that doesn't leave them stressed and anxious all the time. And at the same time, the people who have the characteristics to be willing to do that aren't necessarily as demographically diverse as the people museums want to have on staff to represent their communities. So I think, and also another trend we're seeing is a rising, finally we've come around and we're seeing a rising growth of the labor movement, which was in decline for a long time in the US. And when you look at the intersection of all those trends, I think it's fair to say it's going to impact everyone. It's going to impact museums. In the next 10 years, who is going to want to work in museums? What are they going to be willing to give up to do that? Are they going to have higher expectations and standards? If we have a situation where people are no longer effectively underbidding each other to try and get the few jobs available, if people are going to start saying, no, it's a good job or I won't take it, museums might rethink how they recruit, how they pay, who they hire. And in the end, that could be an opportunity to have more equitable jobs for a more diverse workforce.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that was worth waiting through.
Totally worth the wait. There were two questions I want to get to. Lindsay asked a question in the chat a little while ago. Lindsay, would you be willing to just restate your question rather than me read it out loud about horizons?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking about how this pandemic is affecting museums and their ability to plan for the future. A lot of museums tend to have a fairly long horizon. They're looking at what's going to be happening not next month, but next year and the year after and 3 to 5 years beyond. They have their strategic plans, they have their interpretive plans, what's going to happen on the exhibit schedule. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any sense about, sort of across museums, how is this pandemic affecting institutions' ability to think like that? Are we still doing that as an industry, or is that itself going to change? That has been sort of fundamental in some ways for a lot of museums.
Who wants to take that one?
Can I just attest first that I did not pay Lindsay to ask that? And you'll see why I had to issue that disclaimer in a minute. Koven, do you want to go first?
No, I feel then, well, you can't just tease that and then not say. Okay. So I think you should answer.
Because this is my job. So this is where I preach the gospel of strategic foresight, Lindsay, and this is where I hearken back to my own introduction of myself, which is, I was engaged with the Accreditation Commission for years as they tried to articulate the standards for organizational planning. And it ended up being a fairly detailed list of a good plan has this, that, and the other thing, and it is multi-year and it has action steps. And in a swiftly changing landscape like we're living in, that plan can't possibly be effective and useful because I wake up and the projections today are different from than they were yesterday. We're locked down again. Visitors are saying they don't feel safe unless you reimpose sanitation measures. So one of the things, I'm going to recommend that you download the current edition of Trends Watch 2021, where I have a chapter on planning and how strategic foresight is a method of planning that allows museums to be iterative and rapidly adaptive. It ends up sounding like good digital development, actually, Ed and Koven. And also preview that we'll be publishing a strategic foresight toolkit soon that's going to walk museums through the skills of applying this. I think one of the adaptations museums as organizations have to make is going out there and learning new ways of doing planning that have, in addition to the long game, the shorter horizons of iteration and feedback. And as a field, we have to revisit our standards and say, really, is the way we described a good plan 10 or 20 years ago still the right description of a good plan, and do we have to be more open to what planning looks like and still meeting the standards of being an effective and responsible museum?
All right. Coven, what do you want to add to that?
Not much. That was pretty comprehensive, but I mean, just anecdotally, one thing that I will say that's kind of interesting in talking with museums over the last year is how many are still stuck with temporary exhibitions that they had planned to send back, you know, in early 2020. And it's like, hey, that exhibition is still here, still going strong, like we've, you know, which is kind of interesting because, you know, I certainly know this is entirely anecdotal, but, you know, from my own personal experience, almost every museum I've worked at, no, literally every museum I've worked at, did far too many temporary exhibitions per year. Like it's something that I feel like just kind of got out of hand in the last 10 years or so, that, you know, museums that, especially art museums, that were going from doing, you know, 2 or 3 temporary exhibitions a year, we're going to doing 8, 9, 10 of them with the same amount of staff, you know, the same resources. And so, you know, I'm wondering, especially if we're with reduced staff levels, if we might see some return to sanity there. And if that's the case, you know, that affects the time horizons too. Because I mean, so much of those longer horizons you're talking about are really scheduled around sort of, well, here's when the availability of that show, that temporary show is going to be. And so I wonder if we'll see a change there. This is sort of like a sideways answer to your question, Lindsay.
No, but I think that's great, because temporary exhibitions have been such a tent pole for so many in the field, and the analogies between temporary exhibition consumption and drug addiction are many and varied. You know, you gotta do more, you gotta do bigger to get the same amount of impact. And how do you get off that merry-go-round once you get on it? Maybe it takes something like a pandemic to sort of break that habit. That would be a lovely outcome of the pandemic if that did become true. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed on that one.
Lindsay, did you have sorry, Lindsay looked like maybe she was ready to come back at us on that.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about temporary exhibits and seeing so many of them prior to the pandemic, certainly in my personal experience is true. I think a lot of that is done in chasing the goal of getting your visitors to come back again, to become habitual visitors. We want you to come back every month. We love you. Come back, have lunch, see the next big thing. And you know, if museums have to go back to 1 temporary exhibit a year or 2 a year, maybe some of that digital platform, the creative approach to using the digital platforms available to them over the pandemic can help them chase those different audiences, so they don't have to return to the wicked expense of those cyclical temporary exhibits over and over again. But it is going to be very hard to squash that urge to try to get people to come back again.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, you know, some of the problem there is, I think that's very much a response to the problem of attendance that's driven almost exclusively by the curatorial imperative, you know, and that's one way to address the problem, but it is not the only way. And it'll be interesting to see if we get more museums that are doing exactly what you're talking about, which is, look, we're going to do fewer exhibitions, but we're going to address the question of people, you know, we still want people to return more often and, you know, feel that this is a place they can be, you know, through programming, especially through digital programming. I think it'll be interesting to see. I'm not sure if that's going to be what happens, but it'll be interesting. Thank you. What a great question. That was awesome.
Okay, on that note, I'm conscious that we're running short on time. So I want to leave a minute at the end for Alex to give us a little bit of a wrap up. But before then, if you two want to give Jason a couple of seconds of what your thoughts are on the current trend in unionization in museums, since he asked that question a while ago.
Over to you, Elizabeth. I'm for it. Over to you, Elizabeth.
I think it's interesting to see it in the context of the larger national trend. I think one of the things I'm really interested in is how we as a country can kind of reframe the question of employment in a way that's based more on nonprofit values than on for-profit company values. I feel like for so much of our history, the nonprofit sector has chased or have chased the tail of or taken for-profit business as a model for how to operate. And I wish we could turn it around. I wish we could turn it around and really rebuild the nonprofit sector in a way that's based on our values of public benefit and looking at the change you make in the world, and get the for-profit sector to follow us. One of the things I'd like to commend to your attention is a current initiative by the Institute for the Future called Equitable Enterprise, which is basically looking at this question: how can we use design thinking to create systems as a society and as organizations that focus on equity and fairness as an outcome, and not just on whatever you're defining as profit, whether that's a company paying profits to shareholders or whether it's a museum trying to, however we define it, which sometimes we have trouble doing.
Great, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I just popped the URL for that in the chat. And I think to keep us on time and to be respectful of everybody's needs to get on with their day, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to wrap us up for the afternoon. And I want to thank you all for coming. Especially, I want to thank Elizabeth and Coven for giving us their time and their smarty pantsness. Keep doing what you do.
Thank you on behalf of TAM for sharing with us some really great perspectives. I've been working with these folks for a long time. Have very lots of respect for what the work they do. So thank you for joining us, Beth and Coven, and Ed for keeping us going. Keep the third Wednesday of the month on your radar. Come visit our site. If you are a TAM member, thank you for being a member. We are continuing to grow our membership in the different regions of Texas and beyond. We have several different member options we've refreshed so that it's based on staff size instead of budget size, because I know that's something that has changed considerably over the years. Academic membership, and then a few individual selections. The other thing that we are working on is going back to a conference. And so we have a conference planned in March of 2022 in Waco in a number of venues across the city. So we're going to be doing a decentralized hybrid conference, which means we will be in a different location every day, separated in different areas of the museum, and then coming together in outdoor locations in a safe way. Right now, we've just are opening up our sponsorship opportunities for that, but I just wanted to tease some of the keynotes that we have planned, because I think we have some really great ones. Our first is John Falk. John Falk just 9 days ago released a book, The Value of Museums Enhancing Societal Well-Being. It's a really important way of looking at, I think we've looked at museums in terms of the economic impact, but what kind of impact does the museum have on our well-being? The other keynotes we have is Chris Taylor and Cinnamon Legutko, or Catlin Legutko, the authors of The Inclusive Museum Leader, another book that has recently come out. Both of those two groups of speakers are going to be with us all week. So if you want to grab a beer with one of these people, it's be a good time to do that. If you don't know about Colleen Dillenschneider's work, Know Your Own Bone, please check her work out. All of us have referenced her work in some way, and then we're going to have her bring her in virtually to close out our conference. And part of our workshops, we're bringing Holly Truitt to come in to do a co-creation workshop. So really excited about some of the programming that we have for the TAM 2022. Really looking forward to getting back together. And then for those of you that can't make it to Waco, we will have a best of program, virtual program after, using the conference app to bring us all together. So really a lot of opportunities to engage over the year through membership, or really in a concentrated manner through our annual meeting. So please keep an eye out for our announcements around that. And in the meantime, we will follow Ed's blog posts, and I know he has some white papers coming out between now and June. So with that, I want to thank you for your time today and for the great conversation. I will go ahead and get this edited down and distribute out to everyone so that you have that, and then I'll take the links. I know they have quite a few, and condense them into something that you can reference later. So thank you for your participation. Thank you all. And that's all for today. Goodbye.
All right. Take care,
Bye,
all.
folks.